In my last video, I talked about 5 common mistakes you can easily avoid on your cherry blossom trip. This time I want to share a bit about the places I visited last year, just to give you a rough idea of what you might want to add to your wish list. Because honestly, I know how hard it is these days to tell the difference between hyperbole and genuine opinions. Everything's either a must-visit or a hidden gem. I'm just getting tired of it.
I'm tired, boss.
Sometimes I just wish someone would keep it real. Just show me a few places, throw in a quick opinion, and leave it at that. So since I was there last year, I figured it'd be cool to show you the actual places I visited on that trip and share my honest take on each one. That way, you'll at least have some reliable info to work with. I'll be rating each spot based on 3 things: how good the cherry blossoms were, how interesting the place is in general, and how comfortable the experience was. Like, was it super crowded? Was it a pain to get to? That kind of stuff. Also, just because a place ends up in a lower tier doesn't mean you shouldn't go. It's more about knowing what to expect if you do decide to go. Hope that makes sense. Now obviously it's still going to be pretty subjective, that's just the nature of the topic. But I'll try to explain the reasoning behind each rating, so even if you don't agree with my take, you can still decide for yourself whether a place is worth checking out or not. Before we dive in though, just a heads up. All the cherry blossom spots I visited were either in Tokyo or Kyoto, so this list only covers places in those 2 cities. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Since my trip started in Tokyo, that's where we'll begin. First up, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government Building. The Sakura season in 2024 came late, so even though there weren't many cherry trees here, this was where I saw my first blossom of the trip, which made it feel pretty special. There weren't many people around either, and the trees lining the street were just blooming quietly and unapologetically. The streets felt modern, sterile, and maybe even a little too wide. Under the pale sunlight, the whole place had this strange, almost surreal atmosphere, but it was very enjoyable. Towering above was the low poly techno cathedral itself, and at its base, the Citizens Plaza. The architecture has this almost religious quality to it, which reminded me of St. Peter's Plaza in Vatican City, except instead of marble and limestone, it's all concrete and glass. Beyond the blossoms and the architecture, this spot also gets extra points for the observation deck at the top. After a short wait, you get a full panoramic view of Tokyo, completely free. There's even a piano up there, ready for you to channel your inner Beethoven or Joe Hisaishi 200 meters above ground. So do practice your piece before you come. In all, I know it's not a classic cherry blossom spot, but even with just a few trees, it ended up being one of my favorite places of the trip. Solid A tier. Next up, we have the Tokyo Sakura tram. Now this one isn't a single location, it's a series of bite-sized adventures linked together by the tram route. You just enjoy each stop at your own pace, then hop back on and ride to the next. I started in Nihonbashi, a classic city canal spot. Since the season came late, the trees were still pretty bare, but I can imagine the view from the bridge would be fantastic at full bloom. Normally I don't care too much about spots like this. City canals with a hint of sewer water just ain't my thing. But because of the delayed season, there weren't many tourists around, and the walk along the river turned out to be surprisingly peaceful. Locals, young and old, were just as excited as I was to see the early blossoms. And even though the bloom hadn't peaked, the local Sakura Matsuri was in full swing. A lady was performing on a makeshift stage, kids were loudly crying for bowls of golden udon. It all felt like a peaceful slice of local everyday life, far removed from Tokyo's usual fast-paced energy. The rest of the tram adventure had a similar vibe, a slow, quiet journey that at times didn't even feel like Tokyo. I had to rely a bit on imagination to picture how beautiful it could have been if the sakura had bloomed on time, but still, it was a memorable experience. If you have a free afternoon and want something low-key and slow-paced, you should definitely consider giving it a try. A tier. At the end of my Sakura tram adventure was Rikugien Garden, which features a nice pond in the middle and a little stone bridge that makes for a pretty zen set piece. But aside from that, it felt like a very on-the-rails kind of experience. You just follow the crowd along the path until you're done. There was one corner of the park dedicated to cherry trees, with a particularly large one in the center. There were literally hundreds of people taking pictures of just that one tree. Don't get me wrong, it was a beautiful garden, but with that many people crammed into such a small space, all sharing just a handful of cherry trees, it just didn't make for a very compelling experience, even if you caught it at full bloom. I'm putting it in C tier. Not too far from Rikugien Garden is Asukayama Park, a spacious park filled with cherry trees and a huge play area for kids. Apparently, the late Sakura season didn't stop the locals from having a good time. Even under the bare branches, people were out there with friends and family, enjoying the moment. The park was absolutely packed, but the liveliness made it feel like a place where people genuinely hang out, not just somewhere you go to take a few photos for social media and then forget about. I probably would have rated this place higher if I had visited during full bloom. The photos I've seen look unreal. But since I didn't get to experience that firsthand, I'll play it safe and put it in B tier. That said, if you're traveling with kids or happen to be nearby when the trees are in full bloom, definitely bring a picnic blanket and enjoy the cherry blossoms the way they're meant to be enjoyed. Next up, we have Ueno Park. It's supposed to be one of the major sakura viewing spots in Tokyo, but again, I didn't get to see much in terms of blossoms, but it doesn't mean I didn't have a great time there. I arrived at Ueno Park by subway, and it was already getting a bit late in the day, but to my surprise, there was some kind of carnival or festival going on. Rows and rows of food stands lined the path, and a male idol group was performing on the main stage, singing, dancing, and just generally being cute. It was a very Japan moment. I came in with low expectations, and suddenly I was in the middle of something really fun and unique. It was such a good vibe. As I followed the path lit by traditional lanterns, the festive mood was so very much in the air, despite the underwhelming bloom, that for once I actually enjoyed the company of the excited crowds. In the end, the flowers are just a symbol. It's more about the people you're with and the moments you share. I know it's hard to embrace that mindset when you've spent a lot of money only to be met with bare branches, but for me, the little journey through Ueno Park was genuinely enjoyable. But since the bloom wasn't quite there yet, and I don't know if the festival was a one-time thing or it's there to stay, I'll give it a B tier. I can't rate it higher just based on what it could be, but still, I do think it's really worth a visit. The next location is Chidorigafuchi Park, which shows up on a lot of lists as one of the top cherry blossom spots in Tokyo. And to be fair, there is, in my opinion, one angle that's mildly interesting enough for an iconic Instagram shot if you're here at full bloom. But beyond that, there's really not much else going on. If you want, you can rent a rowboat, which is kind of a thing here. But aside from that, it's just an unremarkable path lined with some cherry trees that sticks very closely to the classic tourist formula. C tier. Shinjuku Gyoen is another well-known cherry blossom spot in the classic big city park configuration. As one of Tokyo's largest and most popular parks, known for its rich variety of vegetation, it naturally has no shortage of cherry trees in all types and colors. But of course, that also means there's no shortage of people. Expect to make way for the occasional streamers who set up camp, along with personal photo shoots that are either completely unaware or just don't care. I found the experience less charming compared to smaller, lesser-known parks. It's fine if you just want to see the flowers and snap some photos, but if you're hoping to actually sit under the trees and enjoy some relaxed time with friends or family, I think there are better spots. B tier. The last place in Tokyo I want to talk about is Sakura-dori and the Nihonbashi area in general. Nihonbashi was the kilometer zero of all 5 major highways across Japan in the Edo period, and therefore served as the country's commercial center for hundreds of years, long before newer hubs like Shinjuku and Shibuya came into the picture. Today, it's still one of Tokyo's key business and financial districts, home to major banks, institutions, and corporate headquarters. While it doesn't have any flashy landmarks or big tourist draws, the streets here carry a quiet elegance rooted in history. Modern mirrors and old-world marble standing side by side. If you time your visit right, cherry trees will line both sides of almost every street in the area, and in those moments I really wished I could slow down time so I could stay for just a little longer. I know everyone has their own preferences, but I've always liked it when the flowers aren't the only thing on display, when they enhance the scenery rather than overpower it. Nihonbashi does that perfectly. If I could go back for another season, I'd definitely revisit and enjoy another laid-back afternoon with golden sunlight and pink petals drifting in the early spring breeze. A tier. Now, as we head south, it should come as no surprise that the cherry blossom spots begin to offer a very different experience. Instead of complementing urban modernity and the city's liveliness, they bring us closer to nature itself and offer a glimpse into the almost philosophical elegance of Kyoto's historical heritage. First up in Kyoto is the Kamo River. Since the river runs right through the city, this isn't really a single location, but that also means the crowds are more spread out, which makes the whole experience feel a lot less hectic than it otherwise might be. There are cherry trees all along the riverbanks, so it's hard to pinpoint one specific spot to recommend. But the best way to enjoy it is to set aside an hour or two on a sunny day, take a leisurely stroll along the river, enjoy the blossoms, and listen to the gentle sound of the water flowing by. This is a very classic activity in Kyoto, and the cherry blossom season only makes it better. I'm putting it in A tier. Next up is another classic Kyoto spot, Yasaka Shrine and the Maruyama Park right behind it. Now, Yasaka Shrine is definitely worth visiting on its own, but due to the limited coverage of the shrine grounds, it doesn't offer much in terms of cherry blossoms, so most of the flower viewing will happen in Maruyama Park. The blossoms themselves are fine, but to me, the layout of the park feels a bit all over the place, and the garden design isn't particularly striking. Add in the crowds, and the whole experience ends up feeling a little chaotic. You can sit down and enjoy a fish stick under the cherry trees, but overall, as a cherry blossom spot, it just doesn't deliver, at least for me. C tier, sorry guys. Next is a place I visit every time I'm in Kyoto. I thought I knew it pretty well, so I wasn't expecting much. But once again, Kyoto had a surprise for me. The Kyoto Imperial Garden impressed me all over again, just like it did on my past visits. You won't often see it listed among the top cherry blossom spots, and to be fair, it doesn't have the most cherry trees. But what it lacks in quantity, it more than makes up for in elegance. The garden has a kind of muted grandeur that's hard to find elsewhere, and every cherry tree felt beautifully shaped and thoughtfully maintained. Maybe it was because of the rain, but the place was almost empty. I pretty much had it to myself. Tucked under my umbrella, it felt like I was in a dream, and for once I didn't mind the rain at all. It ended up being one of the most memorable spots of the trip, A tier. Next up is a more niche destination called Rokkaku-do, a beautiful little temple complex hidden away in the busy streets of Karasuma. Despite its smaller size, it had a lot to offer. The hexagonal main hall was unique and looked amazing. The cherry trees within the temple grounds were plentiful, and there were even swans gliding around in a small pond at the back. It was the kind of place you stumble upon and immediately want to tell people about. While it can't compete with the Imperial Garden in terms of scale, it's absolutely worth a visit if you're in the area. A tier. Now this next one might come as a bit of a shocker, but in my opinion, Arashiyama isn't exactly a great flower viewing destination. If you check it out on Google Maps, you'll spot a few cherry trees here and there. Those are the actual trees you will see. What you will not see, however, is what some of these social media photos are showing. I'm just disappointed that some people felt the need to create fake photos like that just to throw off everyone's expectations. What I'm showing you right now isn't quite peak bloom, but it's not far off either. So just to be clear, the hills in the distance won't turn pink like that. You won't see anything even remotely close to what's been edited into those pictures. However, this isn't me trying to convince you to take Arashiyama off your list. The point is, if you're planning to visit, come to enjoy Arashiyama for what it truly is, but not as a cherry blossom destination. If you do that, you'll be able to appreciate it so much more. As much as I love Nanzenji, the cherry blossoms just don't outshine the temple's stunning architecture and incredible atmosphere. So for flower viewing specifically, I'd place it in the B tier. But there's another popular spot that you're pretty much guaranteed to pass by on your way to Nanzenji, and that's the Kyoto Railway Incline. This place only really gets mentioned during Sakura season, so even though I'd visited Nanzenji a few times before, I only found out about it on my last trip. It's right across from Kyoto subway station, an old disused stretch of railway now submerged in a sea of pink petals. Yes, the crowds can be pretty intense, and there aren't any hidden corners or trails to explore, but it's unique enough, and the cherry blossoms were good enough that it deserves a spot on your itinerary. Plus, it's compact. You can see the whole thing in under 30 minutes. Solid A tier. The next one is probably the most widely known cherry blossom spot in Kyoto, the Philosopher's Path. It was a nice little walk along the canal in a quieter part of Kyoto. There were cherry trees every few steps on both sides, forming a floral corridor that shut out the outside world. Even though it hadn't reached full bloom yet, it was still a sight to behold. The canal added a lot to the atmosphere too. I wish I were a duck, so I could paddle through the gentle stream dotted with cherry petals, just like these guys. The only gripe I had was that I thought this was meant to be a quiet, reflective place, but I doubt anyone's going to enjoy a moment of introspection when you're dodging selfie sticks and surrounded by constant chatter in every direction. I'm sure it would feel completely different early in the morning or late at night. That's something I'll have to try next time. That said, I still think it's one of the best and most atmospheric cherry blossom spots in Kyoto. It deserves a solid A tier. I've mentioned that I prefer when the blossoms complement an already established scenery, and the next place is another spot that fits that description perfectly. Now, Daigo-ji isn't usually considered one of Kyoto's most popular destinations. Most of you probably haven't even heard of it, at least I hadn't. That's because it's a bit out of the way, tucked into the Yamashina ward. You'll have to take the subway far beyond the usual stops, and then transfer to a special local bus just to get there. But Daigo-ji is worth that extra mile. It's laid out in 4 distinct parts. Every time I thought I'd seen it all, something new would pop out at the next corner. Towering cherry trees, temple halls, traditional gardens, ancient pagodas, moss-covered forests, everything. It's like a fascinating adventure through time, made even better by the presence of blossoms at almost every step. The cherry blossoms are great, there's a lot to explore, and since the temple grounds are huge, you don't really feel the crowds that much. I don't want to oversell it, but if there's one spot on this list that deserves the S tier, it's this one. That's not to say the final spot on the list is anything less than remarkable, but it's kind of the polar opposite of Daigo-ji. Whereas Daigo-ji lets the cherry blossoms complement a beautiful existing setting, here at Seo-ryu-tei, the blossoms don't just take the front seat, they are the front seat. I won't be surprised if someone told me that this is the spot in Kyoto with the most cherry trees. I say in Kyoto, but it's actually pretty far from the city center. You'll need to take about an hour-long train ride to get there. What awaits you is 1,400 meters of nothing but cherry trees. Just cherry trees. No temples, no shrines, no gardens. It's pharmaceutical-grade flower viewing in its purest form. But the absence of a clear centerpiece means it's best enjoyed slowly. You should pick a sunny day, block off an entire morning, pack your favorite food and drinks, bring a picnic blanket, and enjoy it like it's the last spring day this cruel world will ever see. I wish there were more to explore, but I guess an escape into a world made of cherry blossoms, no ifs, no buts, no caveats, is something most of us can still very much appreciate. I'll put it in A tier. And that is my personal cherry blossom tier list for Japan. I hope it gave you a bit of insight for your upcoming journey. Enjoy your trip, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.